to part 3 of our Flip and Sew Lapghan video series. This is the last video in our series, so we must be getting close to being done. In this video, I will show you how to straighten and trim up your Lapghan and then make and sew on the finishing binding. Again, have your notions handy, and if you need to, rethread your machine with thread that matches your binding fabric. Or you can also use a contrast color to show off your decorative stitching. Let's begin. First, with your scissors, trim the excess backing and batting away from the top and bottom strips. This strip on the end should be already sewn down through all the layers. Be careful not to cut through the stitching. Next, place the Lapghan on your work table on top of a cutting mat or line it up with the bottom straight edge of your work table. Now we're going to trim off the sides. With the long cutting ruler or a yardstick, find the even spot along the bottom edge. To help straighten before you cut, line up the grid markings on your ruler with the seams on the Lapghan. Visually check to make sure you won't be cutting any strip off too short on the edge. Now draw a line and cut, preferably with a rotary cutter, and trim off the edge. Move the ruler up as you go and keep cutting and keep checking for straightness. Now repeat this for the other edge. Stitch a scant 1/4 inch away from the cut edges on both of the long sides. This will help hold the materials in place and be less likely to shift when you're sewing on the binding. But if you're confident with your sewing abilities, go ahead and skip this. Now for a little quilt math. To make sure we have enough binding for our Lapghan, measure your Lapghan length and width. Add these two numbers together and then multiply by 2. Using my Lapghan as an example, 37 plus 37 plus 46 plus 46 equals 166 inches perimeter. Add 12 inches for corners and joins, and that's a total of 178 inches in length. Now divide this by the width of the fabric, which is usually 42 inches, and I find that I need 5 strips for my binding. Everyone seems to have their favorite method for making binding. For this project, you do not need a true bias binding, so we are going to make traditional quilt binding with an invisible join. For this binding, you will cut 5 strips out of your material 2 1/4 inch wide by the width of the material, but you can cut the strips either lengthwise or crosswise. You can also cut them 2 1/2 inches wide, which will give you a thicker binding. Now we need to join these strips together to make one long piece. Take the first strip of binding and place it right side up on your workspace. Take the second strip and place it perpendicular to the first with right sides together so it's forming a 90-degree angle. Overlap the edges a little bit so you do not incorporate the selvages into the binding. Next, take a ruler and line it up from where the pieces intersect on the top left to the bottom right corner. Draw a straight line with a fabric marker. This is your stitching line for joining. Put a pin across the join to hold it in place and go to your machine to sew the strips together along this stitching line. Trim the joining seam down to 1/4 inch and repeat for the rest of the strips until you have one long continuous piece. Take the binding to your iron and press open the seams and trim away any dog ears. Fold over one corner so it forms a 45-degree angle and press. Now trim off this angle about 1/4 inch away from that 45-degree fold in order to reduce bulk. Now fold the binding in half lengthwise and press it down. Continue folding and pressing the whole strip. Place a pin at the beginning angle and then measure down about 6 inches from the point and place another pin into the binding. This second pin is where we're going to start sewing the binding onto the Lapghan. So turn your Lapghan over to the back, because with this binding method we're going to sew the binding onto the back and then flip the binding around and stitch it down on the right side. But before you start, check 2 things. First, check that you have a full bobbin, and if you need to, make a seam guide for your sewing machine out of painter's tape. Just build up the tape with several layers so it creates a small lip, and then place it on your machine a 1/4 inch away from your needle so you can sew a consistent 1/4 inch seam. Now put the binding on one of the long sides about halfway down, and remember to start sewing it on from the second pin and keeping that leading portion free. As you're sewing down the first side towards the corner, make sure you stop several inches away from this corner. Measure up about a 1/4 inch from the corner and put in a pin. This is where you're going to stop sewing. So sew down to the pin, stop with your needle in the down position, put your presser foot up with the needle still down in the fabric. Pivot the material so you can sew off through the corner at a 45-degree angle. Once you hit the corner, take 1 or 2 stitches back and then sew forward again off of the corner. Put your presser foot up, needle up, and break off the stitching. Now take the binding and fold it back on itself to match the 45-degree angle. Make sure the fold is flush along the top and the raw edges line up on the side. And with your fingers, you should be able to feel a 45-degree angle underneath. Now put a pin across the top and pin it again down about 2 inches. Start sewing again down the next side. You can either sew directly onto the material from the corner, as long as you do not sew over the flap of the binding underneath, or you can start sewing 1/4 inch away from the corner. Keep sewing the binding on, repeating stopping at each corner a 1/4 inch away from the raw edge, turning, stitching out the point, and then folding the binding back on itself. When you get back to where you started, stop about 2 to 3 inches away from your beginning point. We are going to stuff the end of the binding into the beginning edge to make a nice smooth finish to the binding. But first, we need to trim off the excess binding a couple of inches lower than the pocket. Now take the end of this binding that you just cut and stuff it inside the beginning pocket, pushing the end inside with a stiletto or something pointed. Play with it until the transition is smooth and there are no wrinkles. Now pin the binding down and finish sewing it onto the Lapghan. Hey, hang in there, we're almost done. Turn the Lapghan so the right side is up. Pull on the binding so it lays out flat and give it a quick press. We are going to stitch the binding down with a decorative stitch. I find this is much more successful for beginners than sewing it down with a straight stitch and hoping your stitches line up on the back. So take a scrap of binding and test a few decorative stitches on your machine. Find an easy one like a zigzag or a little scallop, and make sure the length is agreeable and it is not too wide so the stitch will go off the binding. You can use matching thread or contrasting thread depending on the look that you want. Starting on one of the sides, pull the binding over to the front so it just covers the stitching line. Pin or clip. Notice that your clips have a flat side and a rounded side. Place the flat side on the bottom of your Lapghan, as that curved side seems to fit better over the binding. When you get down to the corner, keep pulling over and pinning the leading edge all the way to the corner. Turn your work and work towards that same corner from the other direction. Now lay your stiletto, purple thing, or pointer in the 45-degree crease to hold down one side and fold up the other side over the pointer to form a mitered corner. Pin or clip. Now keep sewing around your quilt, pulling the binding up and over the stitching, and watching to make sure your deco stitches don't go off either side. If you find that it helps, I like to use a stiletto to help place the binding. I stab the binding with a stiletto, then pull it over so it covers the stitching, and then stab it into the Lapghan to keep the binding steady until I can sew it down. Now when you come to a corner, stitch down to the end, stopping your sewing with your needle swings to the furthest right, and with the needle down, Put the presser foot up and pivot the fabric, and then put your presser foot back down to continue sewing the other side. Repeat until you get back to the beginning. Ta-da! Now take a minute and look at this lovely lapghan you've just created. Aren't you proud of yourself for hanging in there and getting it done? I want to sincerely thank all the Crafting Change sewists who came to our Flip and Sew-a-thon Lapghan class. You all are so generous with your time, talents, and efforts, and be assured you are helping to change lives. Now, if you would like to join us and craft for a cause you care about, you can find us at www.craftingchange.org, or you can request to join our group on Facebook. We are the Crafting Change community. Thank you.